The needle was broken. That was the first thing Overseer Velthon noticed when she reviewed the contact logs from listening station orales. Not the absence of a signal, not the diplomatic silence, not the years of unanswered transmissions. The needle on the analog pressure gauge mounted beside the quantum receiver array had been snapped clean at the base, and someone had filed the break smoothly. Not an accident, filed smooth. She set the log tablet down and looked out through the station's observation port at the dark, unremarkable stretch of space that corresponded to the third planet of a yellow star. A world the Galactic Accord had catalogued as pre-emergence class 4, biologically active, technologically primitive, politically incoherent. Earth. The Accord had been transmitting to them for 11 years. 11 years of mathematical sequences, of light pulse greetings, of carefully calibrated first contact protocols designed by 17 species across 4 centuries of accumulated diplomacy. 11 years of silence. And someone at some point had filed that needle smooth. The laughter had begun, as most institutional mockery does, quietly. A junior attaché in the Accord's diplomatic corps made a remark during a briefing about resource allocation, something about the cost of broadcasting to a species that apparently hadn't noticed, and it spread the way small cruelties do, gathering weight with each retelling. By the third year of silence, Earth had a nickname in the lower corridors of Accord headquarters, the Deaf World. By the 6th year, the Deaf World had become a budgetary joke. Senior Arbiter K. Loon, whose species, the Vrethani, processed information through resonant biofields and had considered silence a form of intellectual death since before recorded history, formally proposed reducing the contact budget by 60% and redirecting resources to a more promising pre-emergence candidate in the Cygnus cluster. "They simply don't understand what we're sending," he said at the tribunal, his resonance filaments rippling in the Vrethani expression of patient condescension. The mathematical sequences alone should have generated a response. Any species capable of basic symbolic reasoning would have answered. No one disagreed. The vote passed, 60% reduction. Earth's contact budget became a rounding error. Velthon had voted with the majority. She remembered it clearly because she had felt, at the time, nothing, no uncertainty, no discomfort, just the quiet confidence of someone participating in the obvious conclusion. That memory would come back to her later. It would come back to her hard. The broken needle was filed smooth in year 9. She confirmed this by pulling the original manufacture records and cross-referencing the microabrasion pattern with available tool signatures. Someone at the station had done it deliberately, and had done it during a shift window that corresponded to, she checked 3 times because the number didn't make sense the first 2, a period when the station's long-range receiver had been operating at full capacity. Not during a maintenance window, not during a calibration check. During active listening. That was the first mystery. Why would someone disable a pressure indicator on a receiver that was actively receiving something? The second mystery arrived 17 minutes later, buried in a secondary log file that had been misfiled under routine atmospheric data. The file contained a single notation, timestamped at 3:47 station time, written in a shorthand Velthon recognized as belonging to the station's former chief analyst, a Meyerth named Sohn whose transfer request had been approved so quickly that his personal effects were still in storage. The notation read, "They heard us on day 1. 3 words, no elaboration, no supporting data. Velthon read the notation 4 times. They heard us on day 1. If that was true, if Earth had received the first transmission 11 years ago and had chosen silence, then everything the Accord believed about the deaf world was not a description of a primitive species that lacked the capacity to respond. It was a description of a species that had decided not to. She was still sitting with that thought when the third mystery arrived, and this one did not come from a log file. It came from the window. Station Orales, this is a core diplomatic vessel Saranath crossing, transmitting on primary frequency. We are holding at designated approach distance pending clearance. Please advise on current receiver status. The voice over the comm belonged to Ship Commander Dara, whose vessel had been dispatched 17 days ago on what was supposed to be a routine supply run with a secondary mandate to collect Sohn's personal effects, and almost as an afterthought, verify the operational status of the station's equipment. Velthon didn't answer immediately. Through the observation port, at the edge of the long-range optical scanner's visible range, something was moving. It was not the Saranath crossing. The Saranath crossing was holding position at the designated approach corridor, which was in the opposite direction. What she was seeing through the port was moving from the direction of the yellow star, from the direction of Earth. It was not large. That was the first thing that struck her. She had, somewhere in the deep unexamined part of her mind, expected something large, because large was what civilizations built when they finally decided to announce themselves. Large was statement. Large was we are here. This was not large. It was a single vessel, roughly cylindrical, with an aesthetic that suggested it had been designed by minds that cared more about function than form, angular, mismatched in places, visibly modified from what its original configuration must have been. Several sections appeared newer than others. It was, she realized, a ship that had been rebuilt multiple times while never stopping. Station Orales, Commander Dara repeated. Please advise on receiver status. Dara, Velthon said slowly, I need you to scan the approach corridor from bearing 279 Mark 14 and tell me what you see. A pause. I'm seeing a vessel, pre-emergence class technology mostly, some anomalous readings I can't immediately categorize. Another pause longer. It's not broadcasting any signal. No identification, no greeting transmission. Nothing, it's just moving, coming in at a constant velocity, straight line. No deceleration pattern that I can wait. The pause that followed was long enough that Velthon counted it. 8 seconds. Velthon, Dara said, it's not decelerating because it's already at its destination velocity. It's not approaching the station. It's approaching the Accord's border marker. The border marker, a pulsing array of navigation beacons that delineated the formal boundary of Accord diplomatic space. A symbolic line, mostly, because pre-emergent species couldn't reach it. It was a line drawn for civilizations that had already arrived. Earth's ship reached the border marker in 42 minutes. It stopped there, precisely there, exactly at the line. And it waited. Senior Arbiter Kaloon arrived at Orally Station via emergency transit 11 days later, which was fast enough that Velthon understood this was no longer her situation to manage alone. He brought with him 3 junior arbiters, a full diplomatic protocol team, and an analyst from the Accord's first contact assessment division whose job title, she later learned, had never actually been used in a field assignment before. The human ship was still waiting at the border. It had not moved. It had not broadcast. It had not responded to any of the 12 greeting sequences the station had transmitted in 11 different formats during the days since its arrival. 11 years of silence, Kaloon said, standing at the observation port with his resonance filaments held perfectly still, which in a Vrethani meant either extreme calm or extreme effort to project extreme calm. And now they appear at our border without a word. At the border, Velthon said, exactly at the border, not inside it. That could be coincidence. Their navigation would need to be precise to within 30 meters at this range for it to be coincidence. His filaments moved slightly. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that a species we classified as unable to process our transmissions has just demonstrated navigational precision that most Accord member species achieve only with full computational support. She looked at the ship on the scanner, and I'm suggesting that we should ask ourselves why they're waiting. They're waiting for us to respond. Are they? Or are they waiting to see how long it takes us to respond? Kei-Lun turned to look at her. His filaments were very still again. Those are not the same thing, he said. No, she agreed, they're not. The decision to board the human vessel, or rather, to invite the human vessel's occupants aboard the station, took 4 days of internal debate that Velthon found excruciating not because it was complicated, but because it was simple and no one would admit it. The ship was waiting. That was all the information they had, and all the information they needed to act on. But the Accord's diplomatic protocol required 14 separate authorization steps for any first physical contact event, and authorization steps required reporting, and reporting required context. And the context in this case was that a pre-emergent species had appeared at the Accord's border without being invited, which didn't fit any existing category, which meant the authorization steps themselves had to be modified, which required additional authorization. It was Commander Dara who cut through it. They've been sitting there for 16 days, she transmitted from the *Saranath crossing, which had moved to a parallel holding position as a precautionary measure. Whatever they're here to do, they're very patient about it. Either we make contact or we don't. The protocol doesn't have a third option. Kei-Lun authorized a response transmission. The greeting was formal, multi-layered, elegant. The standard Accord first contact package refined over centuries of accumulated experience. Mathematical anchoring, harmonic sequencing, a symbolic offering of mutual recognition. 17 species had found it comprehensible on first receipt. The human ship responded in 40 seconds. In Accord standard. Not approximate Accord standard. Not phonetically approximated Accord standard. Precise, grammatically correct, appropriately modulated Accord standard, delivered in a voice that was clearly mechanical, a translation system, but clearly a very good one. Accord Station Aurelis, this is the * Meridian. We request permission to send one representative aboard for formal introduction. We have reviewed Accord diplomatic protocols and will comply with all standard contact procedures. Please advise on your preferred timeline. Velthon heard Kei-Lun's resonance filaments make a sound she had never heard from a Vrethani before. Later, she would describe it as the sound of a certainty collapsing. The human's name was Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, and she was smaller than Velthon had expected. This was, she would later recognize, the first of the misinterpretations. She had expected something physically imposing, some unconscious projection of the idea that a species willing to arrive at a galactic border unannounced would arrive physically suited to the gesture. But Elena Vasquez was slight, dark-haired, with a face that showed signs of extended periods in low-nutrition conditions, and a left hand that moved differently than her right in a way that suggested healed damage rather than natural asymmetry. She was, objectively, the least physically intimidating first contact representative Velthon had ever observed. She walked into the station's formal greeting chamber carrying nothing but a small data chip, held the correct Accord greeting posture within acceptable tolerances despite having presumably learned it from transmitted records, and waited. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, Velthon began, on behalf of the Galactic Accord we welcome. Thank you, Vasquez said. Her voice was calm, not nervous calm, not performed calm, actually calm in the way of someone who has already fully processed the environment and decided it doesn't require fear. I'd like to begin, if that's acceptable, by addressing the 11 years. The silence in the greeting chamber was considerable. The 11 years of silence, Vasquez continued. I understand it was interpreted as inability. I want to be clear that it was not. Kei-Lun's filaments moved. Then what was it? She looked at him with dark, tired eyes. It was a decision. She talked for 3 hours. Velthon had reviewed hundreds of first contact briefings in her career. They followed recognizable shapes, a species establishing its history, its values, its achievements, its desire for relationship. A form of autobiography that was also, always, a form of argument for why this species deserved a seat in the larger conversation. Elena Vasquez did not give them that. She gave them something that took Velthon 2 days to fully understand, because she was listening for the autobiography and kept mishearing what was actually being said. The decision to remain silent had been made, Vasquez explained, not by a government. Earth had 7 major governmental coalitions in the first year of contact, and that number had since changed, not entirely by subtraction, but by a consensus of a different kind. The transmissions had been received, decoded, and analyzed within 8 months of the first contact signal. Earth's mathematics were not, it turned out, inadequate to the task. They had understood the sequences. The debate that followed had been long, loud, and, in the manner of human debates, had involved a great deal of what Vasquez described as people being very wrong in public before arriving at something useful. What were they debating? Velthon asked. Whether to answer. And the conclusion was silence. The conclusion, Vasquez said, was that we needed to understand who we were talking to before we talked to them. Specifically, we needed to understand what happened to species who answered quickly. The room was quiet. You studied us, Kalun said. We studied everything you'd left to study, signal traffic, the records of other first contact events that were detectable in your transmissions, the Accord's internal communication frequencies. You're not as tightly encrypted as you might assume from outside. A slight pause. The 11 years weren't silence. They were a library. We were building one. Velthon thought about the broken needle. They heard us on day 1. And then she thought about something else, about the notation, about Sohn, about his transfer request approved so quickly his effects were still in storage, and she felt the first stirring of something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. What, she said carefully, did you conclude about what happens to species who answer quickly? Vasquez looked at her for a moment before answering, and it was in that moment, in the specific quality of the pause, the way Vasquez appeared to be deciding not how to answer but how much to answer, that Velthon's adjacent to fear solidified into something more specific. We concluded, Vasquez said, that the Accord is very good at making new members feel welcome. She said nothing further on that point. The data chip contained the *Meridian's *mission record, which Velthon spent the next 6 hours reviewing with 3 analysts and Commander Dara, who had come aboard after the human shuttle docked. The Meridian had been in space for 4 years. That fact alone required a recalibration of assumptions, because a 4-year deep space mission from Earth, based on everything the Accord's records indicated about pre-emergent species' technological capacity, should not have been survivable. Not at the distance the Meridian had traveled, not with a crew of 12, not with the propulsion architecture visible in the ship's sensor profile. They modified their propulsion system, one of the analysts said, pulling up a technical schematic derived from the passive scan data, multiple times, while in transit. Is that possible? Dara asked. Apparently. The analyst highlighted a sequence of changes visible in the ship's structural signature. They appear to have made 14 separate propulsion modifications during the 4-year transit. Some of them, he paused, some of them are configurations we don't have theoretical models for. Improvised, Velthon said. Creative, the analyst said, with the slightly dazed tone of someone whose professional certainties were being quietly dismantled. The configurations are not random, they're iterative. Each modification builds on the last, as if they were running experiments. In transit. While traveling, yes. Dara looked at the schematic for a long moment. What's the failure tolerance on these configurations? The analyst checked. He checked again. Statistically, he said, several of them had approximately a 30 to 40% chance of catastrophic failure. And they implemented them anyway. All 14. The room absorbed that. Velthon thought about Elena Vasquez's left hand, the heel damage, the way it moved differently. She thought about the crew of 12. Analyst, she said. What's the current crew complement of the asterisk meridian? He pulled the sensor data. Life sign count at departure from Earth was, he frowned. This isn't right. What isn't right? The departure life sign count doesn't match. The current crew count is, he looked up, 8. 12 had left, 8 remained. The asterisk meridian had been in space for 4 years. 4 years of propulsion experiments with 30 to 40% failure rates. 4 years of transit through regions of space that the Accord had charted as requiring specific navigational support that Earth shouldn't have had access to. 4 people were gone, and the 8 who remained had parked their ship at the Accord's border and waited, quietly, without a word of explanation, as if this were simply what you did. The adjacent sphere had a name now. Velthon recognized it because she had felt it once before, years ago, reviewing the military history of a now-defunct pre-emergent species that had briefly threatened Accord stability. The name was, I did not understand what I was looking at. She found Vasquez in the observation lounge, standing at the port, looking out at the dark. Your crew, Velthon said without preamble. 4 are missing from the departure count. Vasquez didn't turn from the window. Yes. Propulsion experiments. A pause among other things. What other things? Vasquez turned. Her face was composed in a way that Velthon was beginning to understand was not the absence of emotion but its containment, something held behind something. We encountered a navigational anomaly in the outer system transit that required a manual hull repair, external in vacuum. The repair was successful. And the person who performed it successfully, Vasquez said, and was recovered. She's one of the 8, a beat. The other 3 are a longer conversation. I'm not going anywhere. Something shifted in Vasquez's expression. Not softening exactly, more like recognition, the recognition of someone who, across a vast difference in biology and history and scale, has just heard a sentence that translates exactly. We had a navigation system failure on year 2, she said. We were running on manual calculation for 63 days. During that time, we lost 2 crew members to a hull breach caused by a navigational error we wouldn't have made with the system online. She looked back at the window. The 3rd chose to remain in a sealed section of the ship when a propulsion experiment created a temperature anomaly. His presence in that section maintained thermal balance for the reactor long enough for the experiment to complete. He made the choice himself. The observation lounge was very quiet. He knew the outcome, Velthon asked. He had approximately 4 minutes to consider it. A pause. He spent 3 of them on the internal comm, talking to his daughter. She was back on Earth. Velthon did not have the biological architecture for the sensation humans described as something caught in the chest. But she had, in 40 years of diplomatic work, encountered enough grief to recognize it in someone else. Why, she asked, and she meant the voyage, the modifications, the silence, the 4 years, the cost, all of it compressed into the single question. Why was it worth this? Vasquez looked at her with those dark, tired eyes. Because, she said, we needed to know if the door was real before we knocked on it, and we needed to know it ourselves, not because someone opened it for us. The mission record on the data chip contained more. Velthon had not, she realized, been reading it carefully enough. She had been reading the asterisk meridian's asterisk technical logs. She had not read what was on the chip's secondary partition, which she accessed at 200 station time when she couldn't sleep and found herself back at her terminal running searches she couldn't fully articulate. The secondary partition contained observation reports. 11 years of them. Earth had not only been listening to the Accord's transmissions. They had been building a record, a systematic, methodical, extraordinarily detailed record of Accord diplomatic history, structural organization, member species relationships, historical conflicts, and what Vasquez had called in the briefing, patterns of integration. The record was good. It was better than good. It was, in places, more accurate than the Accord's own internal historical summaries, because it was written by observers who had no institutional incentive to flatten inconvenient details. In the section on pre-emergence integration history, someone had highlighted a pattern in 17 previous first contact cases. Species that responded quickly to Accord transmissions, accepted diplomatic relationship early, integrated into the Accord structure within the first decade. Those species, without exception, had reduced autonomy in the second decade. Not through coercion, through structural dependency. Resource relationships, technology transfers, diplomatic alignments that accumulated into something that looked like partnership and functioned, gradually, like management. Someone had written a note in the margin of that section. In a compressed format, Velthon needed 2 translation passes to fully render. The note read, 11 years to understand the water before deciding whether to swim in it, worth whatever it costs. She read the note 3 times. Then she accessed Sohn's personnel file and found what she had been half expecting to find, a notation indicating that his transfer request had been preceded by a disciplinary inquiry related to unauthorized data access, specifically, access to the primary contact logs. And before the inquiry, by 11 days, he had filed a report, flagged as speculative and therefore deprioritized, suggesting that the absence of a response from Earth should be reclassified from asterisk inability to deliberate withholding, and that this reclassification warranted a systematic review of contact methodology. The report had been reviewed by one person above his pay grade, marked as lacking evidential basis, and archived. The person who reviewed it was Kay Loon. Velthon sat in the dark of her office for a very long time. The formal meeting the next morning included Kay Loon, Velthon, 2 additional arbiters, Commander Dara and Vasquez. Kay Loon opened with the Accord's standard integration proposal. It was generous, by Accord standards, technology sharing, diplomatic recognition, a preliminary observer status that could evolve into full membership within 8 years given standard development milestones. Vasquez listened to all of it without interrupting. "Thank you," she said when he finished. "I want to respond to something you mentioned, the development milestones. Of course, they're customizable within certain. They were customized for the Velhari in 2,847 cycles," Vasquez said, "and for the Sorathi in 3,012 cycles, and for the Mendari peoples in 3,156 cycles. In each case, the customization involved extending the timeline for autonomous military development while accelerating the timeline for resource integration. By cycle 10 of each case, the species' independent production capacity was structurally entangled with Accord systems to a degree that made disentanglement," she paused, "theoretically possible but practically prohibitive." The room was very quiet. Kayloon's resonance filaments had gone absolutely still. "That information," he said carefully, "is not in public Accord records." "No," Vasquez agreed, "it isn't." "Then where?" "We built a library," she said. "I mentioned that yesterday." Velthon watched Kayloon process this. She watched him arrive at the same place she had arrived at during the night. The understanding that the species the Accord had laughed at for 11 years had spent 11 years doing something the Accord had not anticipated, and had done it quietly, and had said nothing, and had then arrived at the Accord's border with the results. "What is it you want?" he asked. His voice was different now. Something that had been in it before, a quality she now recognized as the resonance equivalent of condescension, was gone. "Recognition," Vasquez said. "Not integration. Recognition. A formal acknowledgement that Earth is a peer participant in galactic space, not a pre-emergence candidate awaiting absorption into an existing structure. The Accord doesn't have that category. Then we'd like to propose creating it." A long pause. "And if we decline," K'Lun said. Vasquez looked at him with the expression of someone who has thought carefully about a question and arrived at an answer they consider both honest and fair. "Then we go home," she said, "and we keep building the library, and in another 11 years or 20 or 50, however long it takes, we come back. With more data, with better ships, with more of us." She held his gaze. "We're patient. It's one of the things we're actually quite good at." The session ended without resolution, which was itself, Velthon reflected, a kind of resolution. The Accord's machinery had no mechanism for ending a first contact session without a preliminary agreement, and so the absence of agreement was catalogued, somewhat helplessly, as *ongoing. She caught Vasquez in the corridor outside the formal chamber. "The third crew member," she said, "the one who stayed in the sealed section." Vasquez stopped. "His daughter," Velthon continued. "How old was she when he made the transmission?" 6, Vasquez said. "She's 10 now." Velthon thought about the mathematics of that. 4 years. A choice made in 4 minutes, with 3 of them spent talking to a 6-year-old. The distance between that moment and this corridor. "Did she know," Velthon said, "what her father was doing?" "We told her he was fixing the ship." A pause. "She's old enough now to understand the real answer. We haven't given it to her yet." "Why?" Vasquez looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "Because she asked us to wait until she was ready. She said she wanted to be proud of him instead of just sad. A beat. She said she's almost ready." Velthon stood in the corridor for a moment after Vasquez walked away. She thought about a 6-year-old and a transmission and 4 minutes and the mathematics of readiness. She thought about a needle filed smooth and a notation in a secondary partition and the sound of K'Lun's filaments collapsing and the asterisk meridian rebuilding itself 14 times in the dark between stars. She thought about the proposal on the table. Recognition, not integration. Peers, not candidates. She pulled out her authorization terminal and began drafting a recommendation. The debate that followed lasted 91 days. The Accord had not had a debate of that length on a first contact question in recorded history. The previous longest had been 43 days, regarding a species that had arrived in force, multiple vessels, an established interstellar network, clear technological parity. The debate there had been about terms. The debate about Earth was about categories, about what Earth was, about whether the Accord had a language for it. The asterisk meridian sat at the border throughout, still, patient, waiting. 2 more vessels arrived on day 37, also Earth ships, also stopping exactly at the border line, also silent, broadcasting nothing but their presence. K'Lun transmitted a request through diplomatic channels asking Earth to explain the additional ships. The response came back in 40 seconds. "They're here to wait with us." On day 62, the Accord's primary assembly accessed the secondary partition of the data chip and read the full 11-year record for themselves. The session that followed was, by every account of people who attended it, unlike anything the assembly had seen. Not because of what was said, because of the silences between what was said, which grew longer and more weighted as the reading progressed. A civilization that had received first contact and said nothing, not because it couldn't, but because it was paying attention. That had spent 11 years building a picture of the galaxy it was about to enter, learning the water before deciding whether to swim in it. That had sent one ship, not a fleet, one ship, rebuilt 14 times, crewed by 12 people who knew the odds and went anyway, and arrived 8 and parked at the line and waited. The primary assembly had spent 4 centuries establishing categories for new life. They had categories for the hostile and the friendly, for the technological and the biological, for the expansionist and the isolationist, for the communicative and the silent. They did not have a category for asterisk deliberately, patiently, thoroughly paying attention. On day 91, the assembly voted. The new category was created. It was not called peer status. That was the name Earth had proposed, and the assembly, in a moment of institutional pride that Velthon found both understandable and slightly comic, felt it necessary to assign a different name, as if the nomming of it gave them back some of the authority the situation had quietly removed. They called it Independent Recognized Standing. It meant exactly what Earth had asked for. Vasquez was in the observation lounge again when Velthon found her with the news. The 3 Earthships were visible at the border, 3 points of light against the dark. The vote passed, Velthon said. Independent recognized standing. The formal documentation will take 8 days to process. Vasquez looked at the 3 ships. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said, genuinely. There are conditions attached to the new category, Velthon said. I want to be honest with you about that. I'd expect nothing less. Some assembly members still consider this a temporary arrangement, a formality. They believe that within 20 years, Earth will seek full integration anyway, that the practical benefits of membership will outweigh the philosophical preference for independence. They may be right, Vasquez said. Are they? She turned from the window. The tiredness in her face was real, permanent, the kind that came from years and not from sleepless nights. But underneath it, Velthon saw something she had been trying to name for 91 days. It was the same thing that filed a needle smooth and hid a notation in a secondary partition, and spent 11 years building a library and rebuilt an engine 14 times in the dark. It was the same thing that made a father spend 3 of his 4 minutes talking to a 6-year-old, so she could be ready to be proud of him. It was the thing that didn't stop. Velthon, Vasquez said, humans have been making decisions about when to stop and when to keep going for a very long time. We're not always right about it. We've been catastrophically wrong about it more than once. A pause. But when we decide not to stop, we genuinely don't stop. That's not strength, that's not strategy, it's just what we do. Is it worth it, Velthon asked, what it costs? Elena Vasquez turned back to the window. Outside, the 3 ships waited at the line, patient and small and present, the way something is present when it has decided, without drama, to remain. Ask me again in 50 years, she said. I'll have a better answer. She didn't sound like she doubted there would be 50 more years. She didn't sound certain there would be, either. She sounded like someone who had stopped requiring certainty as a condition for continuing. Velthon stood beside her for a while, looking out at the border at the 3 lights. She thought about the analyst in the deprioritized report, transferred, his effects still in storage. She thought about the vote she had cast in year 6, the quiet confidence of participating in an obvious conclusion. She thought about the 14 propulsion experiments and the 30 to 40% failure rates and the 8 people who had arrived anyway. And she thought about a girl somewhere on a blue-green planet who was almost ready. The Galactic Accord had, in 4 centuries of diplomatic history, encountered species that were stronger, faster, more ancient, more technologically sophisticated, more harmonically evolved, more biologically efficient, more strategically brilliant than the small, damaged, patient people who had just parked 3 ships at the border of everything and waited without asking permission to exist. But it had never encountered a species that treated the cost of continuing as something separate from the question of whether to continue. A species for whom the cost was acknowledged, real, grieved, and then included in the decision and accepted, and the decision made again, and again in the dark, alone, rebuilt 14 times until they arrived. The Accord had laughed at their silence. It had not understood that the silence was preparation. It had not understood that when they finally stopped being silent, they would arrive already knowing where the door was, already speaking the language, already holding the history, already having paid the price to be there. And that this was not an accident or a miracle but simply what happened when something decided, quietly and completely, not to stop. The three lights held at the border. Velthon did not look away from them for a long time. And somewhere across the dark, on the blue-green planet neither of them mentioned, a girl was deciding she was ready.